The bustling Los Angeles International Airport was alive with its usual chaos on a sunny Tuesday morning. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the California heat as travelers rushed to their destinations, dragging wheeled suitcases across the polished floors. Among the crowd stood Patricia Walker, a 45-year-old marketing executive who practically lived in first-class lounges. She wore her status like a shield designer handbag perched in the crook of her arm, perfectly styled blonde hair, and an expression that suggested the world owed her something. The first-class check-in line wasn't moving as quickly as she thought it should, and her French-manicured fingers drummed impatiently against her phone screen. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, checking her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "I have a meeting to prepare for." Her eyes wandered around the terminal, judging everyone and everything they landed on, until something caught her attention. Near the private aviation entrance stood a black family of 4. The father wore simple jeans and a navy polo shirt, while the mother had on a casual sundress. Their 2 teenage children were dressed just as casually, the boy in basketball shorts and a t-shirt, the daughter in leggings and an oversized university sweatshirt. They were huddled together, consulting their phones and talking quietly amongst themselves. Patricia's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose higher and higher as she watched them. In her mind, they clearly didn't belong anywhere near the private aviation area. She glanced around, expecting security to approach them at any moment. When no one did, she couldn't help herself. "Honestly," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "some people just don't know where they're supposed to be. The regular terminal is that way." She pointed dramatically, making sure her voice carried. A few people in line shifted uncomfortably, but Patricia was on a roll. She caught the eye of a businessman in front of her, trying to draw him into her commentary. "You know what I mean. It's like walking into a 5-star restaurant wearing flip-flops. There are signs for a reason." The businessman quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in his boarding pass. But Patricia wasn't deterred. She waved over a young airport staff member who was walking past. "Excuse me," she called out sweetly, "but I think that family over there might be lost. They're hanging around the private aviation entrance." She emphasized these last words with air quotes. The staff member glanced at the family, then back at Patricia with an unreadable expression. "Thank you for your concern, ma'am, but I'm sure they know where they need to be." Patricia scoffed. "Well, don't say I didn't try to help." She turned back to her phone, but kept watching the family from the corner of her eye. They seemed completely unbothered by her comments, which somehow irritated her even more. The father was pointing at something on his phone screen, while the mother nodded thoughtfully. The teenagers were taking selfies, laughing at something on their phones. Probably their first time in an airport, Patricia muttered under her breath, adjusting her designer sunglasses. She had traveled through LAX countless times for her executive position, and she prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged where. The line inched forward, and Patricia checked her watch again. She had a first-class ticket to New York, where she was supposed to give a presentation to potential clients tomorrow morning. In her mind, she was already rehearsing how she'd tell this story to her colleagues over cocktails about the family who didn't know their way around an airport. Little did Patricia know, the next few hours would completely change her perspective on life. The universe had a lesson planned for her, and it was about to be delivered in the most unexpected way. But for now, she stood in line, secure in her assumptions, unaware that she was about to become the subject of a story that would be told for very different reasons than she imagined. Patricia's irritation grew as she watched the family continue to stand near the private aviation entrance. In her mind, they were disrupting the natural order of things at LAX. She pulled out her phone and started recording a short video, planning to share it later in her private social media group where she often complained about her travel experiences. "You won't believe what I'm seeing right now," she whispered into her phone, trying to be discreet while capturing the family in the background. "Some people clearly don't understand airport protocols." A distinguished-looking older woman in line behind Patricia cleared her throat disapprovingly. Patricia turned around, expecting support, but instead met a pair of stern eyes. Unfazed, she continued her commentary, now speaking to anyone within earshot. "When I first started flying first class," she announced loudly, "I made sure to learn proper airport etiquette. It's really not that difficult to read signs and follow directions." She glanced pointedly at the family, who remained absorbed in their own conversation, seemingly planning their journey. The father was showing something on his tablet to his children, who nodded with interest. The mother adjusted her simple canvas tote bag, which Patricia noted with disdain wasn't a designer brand. The teenage daughter was helping her brother with what looked like homework papers, clearly not understanding this wasn't the place for such activities. Patricia's line hadn't moved in several minutes, and her frustration was reaching new heights. She spotted another airport employee, this one more senior-looking than the last, and waved him over with what she thought was an elegant gesture. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "I hate to bother you, but I'm worried about that family over there." She pointed with her chin. "They've been standing by the private aviation entrance for quite a while now. Perhaps they need help finding their way to the regular terminal." The employee, whose name tag read Robert, looked at the family, then back at Patricia with a slight frown. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but all passengers in this area have been pre-screened. There's no need to worry about other travelers." Patricia felt her cheeks flush. "Well, I'm just trying to help maintain certain standards," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I mean, look at how they're dressed. This is the premium section of the airport, not a shopping mall." Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. A businessman in a sharp suit who had been pretending to read emails finally spoke up. "Ma'am, maybe we should all focus on our own travel arrangements." But Patricia was too invested now. She had constructed an entire narrative in her head about this family, and nothing was going to convince her she was wrong. She watched as the teenage son helped an elderly couple with their heavy bags, rolling her eyes at what she assumed was an attempt to justify their presence in this part of the airport. "Next in line, please," called out the first-class check-in agent. Patricia stepped forward, but her attention remained fixed on the family. She fumbled with her designer passport holder, nearly dropping it as she tried to simultaneously keep an eye on them and handle her documentation. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the check-in agent asked, noticing her distraction. "Oh, yes," Patricia replied, finally turning her attention to the counter. "It's just that some people," she emphasized these words while glancing over her shoulder, "don't seem to understand that there are different sections of the airport for different types of travelers." The agent's professional smile remained fixed in place, but her eyes showed a hint of disapproval. "Your boarding pass, please, ma'am." As Patricia dug through her expensive handbag, she continued her running commentary, now directed at the agent. "You know, when I was growing up, people knew their place. They respected boundaries. Now everyone thinks they can just wander wherever they want." The family had now moved slightly closer to the private aviation desk, and Patricia watched in disbelief as they were greeted warmly by several staff members. She couldn't understand why no one else seemed concerned about what she saw as an obvious violation of airport hierarchy. Little did Patricia know, the universe was about to teach her a powerful lesson about assumptions and prejudice. In just a few moments, her carefully constructed worldview would be shattered, and she would learn that appearances can be deceiving in the most unexpected ways. But for now, she stood at the check-in counter, clutching her first-class ticket like a badge of honor, completely unaware that she was about to become the subject of her own humbling story. Patricia had just finished checking in when the moment she'd been waiting for arrived, though not in the way she expected. A tall, professionally dressed pilot in a crisp uniform walked through the private aviation doors. Her lips curled into a satisfied smirk, certain he would direct the family to the regular terminal. Instead, the pilot's face lit up with recognition as he approached them. "Dr. and Mrs. Richardson." He called out warmly, extending his hand to the father. "It's great to see you again. I hope your medical conference in Singapore was successful." Patricia's mouth fell open slightly. She stood frozen, her designer carry-on forgotten at her feet. "Thank you, Captain Chen," Dr. Richardson replied with a genuine smile. "The conference was excellent. We're looking forward to implementing some new surgical techniques at our hospitals." The pilot turned to the teenagers. "And how are you both? Ready for the flight home?" "Yes, Captain Chen," the daughter responded enthusiastically. "Dad's letting me co-pilot the simulator again when we get back." Patricia's face grew hot as nearby passengers, the same ones who had witnessed her earlier behavior, watched the scene unfold. The businessman who had tried to ignore her earlier was now openly smirking. "Your jet is fully prepped and ready," Captain Chen continued. We've stocked your favorite healthy snacks, and the weather looks perfect for flying today." The word jet echoed in Patricia's ears. She watched, stunned, as a ground crew member appeared to collect the family's luggage. Another staff member she had complained to earlier was now holding the door open for them with obvious respect. As the family walked toward their private jet, Patricia overheard snippets of their conversation. Dr. Richardson was on the phone, speaking quietly but professionally. "Yes, I'll be available for the emergency surgery as soon as we land. Have the team prep the operating room. This patient deserves our best effort." Mrs. Richardson was discussing what sounded like a charity event with her daughter. "We'll need to finalize the arrangements for the scholarship fund dinner. 300 underprivileged students are counting on us." The son was showing his father something on his tablet. "Look, Dad, I finished the code for the medical record system. The rural clinics should find it easier to coordinate care now." Patricia's perfectly manicured hand clutched her chest as the reality of her horrible mistake sank in. The family she had spent the last hour mocking owned a private jet. Not only that, but they were accomplished professionals doing meaningful work in the world. An elderly couple who had witnessed her earlier behavior walked past her, the woman saying loudly to her husband, "My goodness, wasn't that Dr. Richardson? The one who performed that groundbreaking surgery on those conjoined twins last year." Such a humble family, despite all their success. Patricia's legs felt weak. She grabbed her carry-on and hurried toward the first-class lounge, desperate to escape the knowing looks and whispers around her. But fate wasn't finished teaching her a lesson. As she rushed away, she overheard a ground crew member talking into his radio. "Dr. Richardson's jet is ready for departure. Make sure the medical equipment he donated to the children's hospital is loaded." In the lounge, Patricia sank into a plush chair, her face burning with shame. Her earlier videos and comments now felt like evidence of her own prejudice and ignorance. She watched through the large windows as the family boarded their private jet, their casual clothes and humble demeanor a stark contrast to her designer outfit and arrogant behavior. The universe had just delivered a masterclass in humility, and Patricia was the star student, though not in the way she would have ever chosen. As she sat there, processing what had just happened, an announcement came over the speaker that would turn this moment of shame into an even more profound learning experience. But for now, she was left to reflect on how terribly wrong her assumptions had been, and how a family she had judged so harshly was, in fact, making the world a better place in ways she could only imagine. Patricia sat in the first-class lounge, trying to make herself as small as possible, quite a change from her usual commanding presence. She kept replaying her earlier behavior in her mind, each memory making her cringe harder than the last. The gentle classical music playing in the lounge did nothing to soothe her embarrassment. "This can't get any worse," she muttered to herself, sipping her complimentary champagne. The universe, it seemed, took this as a challenge. The lounge's peaceful atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by an announcement that made Patricia choke on her drink. "Attention passengers on Flight AA 1275 to New York. Due to mechanical issues, this flight has been cancelled. Please proceed to the service desk for rebooking options." Patricia's heart sank. That was her flight, the one she needed to take to reach tomorrow morning's crucial client presentation. She quickly gathered her belongings and rushed to the service desk, but she wasn't the only one. A crowd of frustrated first-class passengers had already formed. "What do you mean there are no other flights today?" a businessman at the front of the line demanded. "I have to be in New York by morning." "I apologize, sir," the airline representative said calmly. "Due to a major conference, all flights to New York are fully booked. We can get you on the first flight tomorrow afternoon." Patricia felt panic rising in her chest. Tomorrow afternoon would be too late. She'd missed the presentation entirely. She pulled out her phone and frantically began searching for alternatives, her fingers trembling as she typed. "Private charter companies are all booked too," someone in line announced, causing more groans of frustration. Patricia's perfect blowout was starting to wilt as she grew more desperate. That's when she overheard two airport staff members talking nearby. "Dr. Richardson's jet is headed to Boston. They could probably help some of these stranded passengers, knowing them." Patricia's stomach churned. The same family she had mocked and judged might be her only hope of making it to her presentation. she felt the universe's sense of irony weighing heavily on her designer-clad shoulders. As if on cue, Mrs. Richardson appeared in the lounge, speaking with the airline staff about some last-minute flight details. Patricia watched as other passengers approached her, none of them caring about her casual dress or the color of her skin, only hoping for help in their time of need. Mrs. Richardson noticed the commotion and asked what was happening. The airline representative explained the situation, and Patricia watched in amazement as genuine concern crossed Mrs. Richardson's face, the same face Patricia had looked at with such disdain earlier. "We're headed to Boston," Mrs. Richardson said thoughtfully. "That's not far from New York. Perhaps we could help some of these folks." Patricia stood frozen, torn between her desperate need to make her presentation and the shame of having to face someone she had treated so poorly. She watched as Mrs. Richardson made some calls, presumably coordinating with her husband. Then came the moment Patricia had been dreading. Mrs. Richardson's eyes scanned the crowd and landed directly on her. There was no sign of recognition or malice in her gaze, just genuine kindness. Patricia felt even worse. "We have room for 3 passengers," Mrs. Richardson announced to the group. "Anyone heading to the Boston area?" Several hands shot up, including Patricia's, though hers was barely raised, as if hoping not to be noticed. But the universe wasn't done teaching its lesson. The airline representative, the same one Patricia had complained to earlier about the family, spoke up. "Ms. Walker here has an important business presentation in New York tomorrow morning," she said, a slight gleam in her eye. "Perhaps she could benefit from your help." Mrs. Richardson smiled warmly. "Of course. We'd be happy to help. Boston is just a short drive to New York." Patricia stood there, her face burning with shame, as Mrs. Richardson walked over to her. The same woman she had tried to have removed from the private aviation area was now offering her salvation. The irony was almost too much to bear. "Karma," whispered the businessman who had witnessed her earlier behavior, just loud enough for Patricia to hear. "Sometimes it comes with a first-class seat." As Patricia followed Mrs. Richardson toward the private aviation area, she felt the eyes of everyone in the lounge following her. Her designer heels had never felt so heavy, and her expensive handbag seemed to weigh a ton. She was about to experience the longest and most transformative flight of her life, though she didn't know it yet. Walking across the tarmac toward the private jet, Patricia felt smaller with each step. The sound of her designer heels clicking against the concrete seemed to echo her racing heartbeat. Mrs. Richardson walked beside her, casually chatting about the weather, as if Patricia hadn't spent the last hour trying to have her family removed from the airport. "Beautiful day for flying," Mrs. Richardson said, shielding her eyes from the sun. "The clear skies should make for a smooth trip to Boston." Patricia managed a weak nod, clutching her handbag like a shield. As they approached the jet, she saw Dr. Richardson standing at the bottom of the stairs, talking with their children about something that made them all laugh. The sound of their genuine happiness made Patricia's stomach twist with guilt. "Honey," Mrs. Richardson called out, "we have someone joining us. This is Patricia Walker. She has an important business presentation in New York tomorrow morning." Dr. Richardson's warm smile showed no sign that he remembered her earlier behavior. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Walker. We're happy to help." He turned to his son. "Could you help Ms. Walker with her bag?" Before Patricia could protest, the teenage boy, the same one she had watched with such disdain earlier, was already reaching for her carry-on. "I've got it, ma'am," he said politely. "Watch your step on the stairs." The interior of the jet left Patricia speechless. It was luxurious but not flashy, with comfortable leather seats and warm lighting. Family photos lined one wall, showing the Richardsons at various charity events and medical missions around the world. One picture showed Dr. Richardson performing surgery in what looked like a rural clinic, while another captured Mrs. Richardson speaking at a United Nations conference. "Please, make yourself comfortable," Mrs. Richardson said, gesturing to a seat. "Would you like some water or tea?" "Water, please," Patricia managed to whisper, her throat tight with emotion. She watched as their daughter brought her a bottle of water, the same girl she had mocked for wearing leggings and a university sweatshirt. The label on the water bottle showed it was from a company that donated clean water systems to developing countries. As the jet prepared for takeoff, Patricia couldn't help but notice how the family operated like a well-oiled machine. The children helped with pre-flight checks, showing knowledge that went far beyond their years. Dr. Richardson made several calls about patient care, coordinating with his medical team in Boston, while Mrs. Richardson reviewed documents for what sounded like a major educational initiative. "Mom," the daughter called out, "should we confirm the numbers for next month's scholarship program? The committee needs final headcount for the underprivileged students." "Yes, dear," Mrs. Richardson replied. "Let's make it an even 100 this year. With the new STEM program, we can really make a difference in their futures." Patricia sank deeper into her seat, each word she overheard making her earlier assumptions seem more and more ridiculous. She watched as the son showed his father a laptop screen filled with complex medical data. "The new patient tracking system is ready," he explained. "It should help rural clinics better coordinate care for people who can't afford regular hospital visits." A flight attendant appeared, not in a flashy uniform, but in simple professional attire. "Dr. Richardson, we've loaded the medical supplies for the children's hospital. Would you like to review the inventory before takeoff?" "Already done," Dr. Richardson smiled. "My wife double-checked everything. Those kids will have their treatments by tomorrow afternoon." As the jet began to taxi, Patricia felt tears welling up in her eyes. The family she had judged so harshly was doing more good in the world than she had ever considered possible. Their casual clothes weren't a sign of disrespect for the private aviation area. They were a reflection of their focus on substance over appearance. Mrs. Richardson noticed Patricia's distress and quietly sat down beside her. Instead of judgment or resentment, her eyes showed only compassion. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes life gives us unexpected opportunities to see things differently. Would you like to hear about our family's journey?" Patricia nodded, unable to speak. As the jet lifted off into the clear blue sky, she realized this flight would be about much more than getting to New York for a presentation. It was about to become a masterclass in humility, grace, and the danger of judging books by their covers, taught by the very people she had wrongly judged. The private jet cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, but Patricia's mind was anything but steady. She sat in uncomfortable silence, watching the Richardson family interact with each other and their staff. Every conversation she overheard felt like another brick added to the wall of her shame. Dr. Richardson was in the middle of a video call with his medical team, discussing a complex surgery scheduled for tomorrow. "Make sure the new equipment is properly calibrated," he instructed. "This child deserves our absolute best effort." His voice carried the weight of responsibility, but also genuine care for his patient. The teenage daughter sat across from Patricia, quietly working on what appeared to be a presentation. Curiosity got the better of Patricia, and she couldn't help but glance at the laptop screen. "It's for our youth mentorship program," the girl explained, catching Patricia's eye. "We're helping kids from low-income neighborhoods learn about careers in medicine and technology." She smiled warmly, showing none of the resentment Patricia knew she deserved. The son was engrossed in coding on his tablet, occasionally showing his work to his mother. "The app should help rural clinics track medical supplies better," he explained. "No more shortages if we can help it." Mrs. Richardson noticed Patricia's interest and moved to sit beside her again. "Our children have grown up understanding the importance of giving back," she said softly. "We've tried to teach them that success means nothing if you're not using it to help others." Patricia felt a lump form in her throat. I don't know what to say," she managed to whisper. "The way I behaved at the airport was based on assumptions," Mrs. Richardson finished gently. "We all make them sometimes. The important thing is what we learn from those moments." The flight attendant appeared with lunch, not the fancy cuisine Patricia would have expected on a private jet, but simple, healthy meals. "We prefer to put our resources where they matter most," Dr. Richardson explained, noticing Patricia's surprise. "Every dollar saved on unnecessary luxuries is another dollar for the children's hospital." As they ate, Patricia listened to the family's story. Dr. Richardson had grown up in a small town where the nearest hospital was hours away. He'd watched his own grandmother struggle to get medical care, which inspired his career choice. Mrs. Richardson came from a teaching background and had dedicated her life to educational access for underprivileged students. "But why?" Patricia started, then hesitated. "Why are you being so kind to me after how I treated you?" Mrs. Richardson shared a knowing look with her husband. "Because holding on to anger doesn't help anyone," she said. We've faced prejudice many times, but we've learned that the best response is to keep doing good work and hope that people's hearts can change. The son looked up from his coding. Mom and Dad always say that the best way to fight ignorance is with education and kindness. Patricia felt tears rolling down her cheeks, not caring about her perfectly applied makeup anymore. She thought about how she'd spent the morning judging this family's clothes, their behavior, their very presence in the private aviation area. Meanwhile, they had been focused on saving lives, improving education, and making the world better. A call came through for Dr. Richardson, another emergency consultation. As he discussed treatment options with a colleague, Patricia noticed how the entire family worked as a unit. The daughter pulled up relevant medical files, the son adjusted the video conference settings, and Mrs. Richardson quietly took notes. "We're about to start our descent," the pilot announced over the intercom. "Weather in Boston looks excellent." Patricia looked out the window at the clouds below, realizing how different she felt from the woman who had stood in that airport line just hours ago. Her designer clothes and first-class status suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the real impact this family was making. Mrs. Richardson touched her arm gently. "You know, sometimes the universe has a way of putting us exactly where we need to be to learn important lessons. Would you like to know more about our community outreach programs? We're always looking for corporate partners." Patricia nodded eagerly, pulling out her business notebook, not to prepare for tomorrow's presentation, but to take notes on how she could actually make a difference in the world. As the jet began its descent, she realized this flight had given her much more than a ride to her destination. It had opened her eyes to her own prejudices and shown her a better way forward. 1 year later, Patricia Walker stood in front of a packed conference room at her company's annual leadership meeting. Gone were the designer labels she once thought defined her worth. Instead, she wore a simple but professional blazer, and her face carried a genuine warmth that had replaced her former mask of superiority. "Today, I want to share a story about the day that changed my life," she began, her voice clear and confident. "It's about how a family I judged wrongly at an airport taught me the true meaning of success and dignity." The screen behind her showed photos of the youth mentorship program she had helped establish in partnership with the Richardson Foundation. In one image, Patricia sat with a group of high school students, helping them prepare for college interviews. 12 months ago, I thought success meant flying first class and wearing expensive clothes," she continued, gesturing to a before and after slide that made her audience chuckle. "Now I know it's measured by the lives you touch and the positive change you create." She clicked to the next slide, showing the amazing results of their joint initiative. "Through our partnership with the Richardson Foundation, we've provided internships to 50 students from underprivileged backgrounds. 15 of them are now pursuing medical degrees with full scholarships." The audience broke into applause, but Patricia held up her hand. "Don't clap for me," she said. "This isn't about me. It's about what happens when we learn to look past our prejudices and see the real potential in people." She shared how her company had transformed under her new leadership approach. The diversity training programs she'd implemented weren't just tick-box exercises, they were real conversations about assumptions and bias, starting with her own story. "Remember that presentation I was rushing to that day?" she asked her audience. "I did make it, thanks to the Richardsons, but more importantly, I learned that my whole approach to business needed to change." The screen showed their company's new community outreach statistics. Hundreds of volunteer hours, mentorship programs, and partnerships with organizations serving underrepresented communities. Employee satisfaction had soared, and turnover had dropped significantly. "Last month, something amazing happened," Patricia continued, her voice softening with emotion. "I was at the airport again, in the same terminal where my journey began. But this time, I saw another woman doing exactly what I had done, judging a family based on their appearance." She paused, letting the memory sink in. I walked over to her and shared my story. By the end of our conversation, she was in tears, just like I had been on that private jet. Sometimes, the best way to fight prejudice is simply to share our own moments of learning and growth. The screen shifted to a photo of Patricia with the Richardson family at the opening of a new medical clinic in an underserved neighborhood. "Dr. and Mrs. Richardson taught me that true class has nothing to do with designer clothes or first-class tickets. It's about how you treat people and what you give back to the world. She clicked to a slide showing their latest initiative, a technology training program for young people from low-income communities. This year, we're expanding our partnership. Every department in our company will mentor at least 5 students, teaching them valuable skills while learning important lessons about breaking down barriers. Patricia's voice grew stronger as she reached her conclusion. That day at the airport, I thought I was somebody important because of what I owned and where I sat on the plane. The Richardsons showed me that real importance comes from what you give, not what you have. She looked around the room, making eye contact with her colleagues. So I challenge each of you. The next time you find yourself making assumptions about someone based on how they look, remember my story. Remember that the person you're judging might just be the one who could teach you the most valuable lesson of your life. The room erupted in a standing ovation, but Patricia remained humble, another lesson she'd learned from the Richardsons. After the presentation, she checked her phone to find a message from Mrs. Richardson. Saw your speech on the livestream. So proud of your journey. Remember, changing one heart at a time is how we change the world. Patricia smiled, remembering how far she'd come from that judgmental woman in the airport. Her designer handbag had been replaced by a simple tote filled with student mentorship materials. Her social media, once full of luxury brand photos and first-class lounge check-ins, now showcased success stories of the students she mentored. That evening, as she drove home, Patricia passed the airport. The sight of planes taking off made her smile, each one a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys aren't about the destination, they're about how we change along the way.